Okay, part two of our introduction to art. We finished with the Venus of Willendorf in part one, looking at these stone figurines that were carried around and looking at three different interpretations. And one thing to keep in mind when we're looking at ancient art is just the very fact that we don't know exactly what any of these things really were about. What we have are speculations or ideas, best educated guesses, but really our knowledge of the ancient world and ancient art and ancient history could be changed radically tomorrow with a simple discovery of some alphabet or some other artworks. And so everything I say and everything you read is tentative and speculative and really is just based on what we have for the moment. In terms of the art, the other type of art that was predominant through this part of the world was cave paintings. These were paintings that were done on the stone walls, usually very, very deep in the caves. This is one of the most famous caves. It's called Lascaux in France. When these paintings were first discovered, they were considered a hoax. In other words, they were thought to have been done by modern artists pretending to gain fame and fortune by discovering some ancient cave. So it was a really difficult start getting people to believe that these really were painted by prehistoric man, and in this case, some 10 to 15,000 years ago. The oldest cave paintings are about 30 to 32,000 years ago, so they are contemporary with the Venus figurines, but that's an exception. The vast majority of the cave paintings are somewhere in the 20 to 15 to 10,000 year ago range. So really the earliest form of art, we could say, was the stone art. When the cave paintings came along, they had several characteristics that were very similar, just like the stonework. One, they tended to be primarily animals. In this case, we have a horse. We go to another slide here. We can see the actual cave of Lascaux, and we have a figure down here, so we get a sense of the scale. There were horses, there were cows, there were bison, there were oxen, there was rhinoceros, there was leopards, a great variety of animals, and they were painted on the walls in any sort of position and manner, and often you can see here and you can see here overlapped. In other words, the artist didn't seem to be paying much attention to placement or composition or making it look neat. They just kind of drew right on top of the old work. Again, their work is a mystery. It happens to occur primarily deep, deep, deep within caves. In some cases, you'd crawl on your belly for hundreds of yards in a narrow, dark tunnel till you came into a space similar to this. Cave paintings that exist on the outer walls of the art, we'll see in a minute, in the Mesolithic period, tend to be later works, or there were early works and they've just washed away and we can no longer find them. The meaning of these works is, similarly to the Venus works, unknown. The traditional theories, the original theories, they were for hunting. They were used to teach young hunters maybe about the animals, or they were used as a kind of magic. That if I go back to this one, you can see these kinds of what looks like a spear, or maybe a feather, or an arrow, or some kind of tool next to the animal. It was probably believed that by presenting these animals in caves and visibly hunting them with weapons of hunt, that they might ensure, in some sense, the hunt. It's kind of a magical ritual. That has been discredited by the fact that primarily the animals portrayed on the walls are not the animals we understand the prehistoric man to have eaten, based on the evidence at the bottom of the cave by his food and where he sat and where he lived and where he ate. And so the animals that they ate were not necessarily the animals that they painted. Here's an example of that overlapping I was talking about, where it gets a little bit confusing as to exactly what we're looking at. Here's a particularly good example of what looks like two bison in perspective. And by perspective, I mean it's almost as if they're coming towards us. You see their back legs are smaller, and they seem to be further back than the front ends of the beasts. So the detail with which these were painted might seem relatively crude to you and I, but if you ever tried drawing an animal, you'll see how incredibly difficult it is. And some of these animals, I'll go forward one, actually I'll come back. Some of these animals, looking at the horse, they can tell exactly by the shapes of the head and the neck and the hoofs the exact species of the animal. So they're incredibly well observed, detailed images. In terms of accuracy, again, we see this sort of the contour line, the shapes of the face, and the horns. This comes from the Chauvet Cave in France, and this is the oldest cave painting we have, about 30 to 32,000 BC. And here you can see a series of horses, almost as if the artist was practicing. Here's the line drawing, and then here's the shading. You also notice some other strange animals, rhinoceros. So we don't tend to think of rhinoceros running around France, but they were, saber-toothed tigers, mammoths, things like that. This painting from Lascaux shows again a rhinoceros and some sort of bison, and here we have a very enigmatic figure. Now, one thing about these paintings is that the animals were always painted naturalistically. In other words, if I go back, it kind of looks like the animal. You know, the shape and the shading and the coloring and the horns and the hair and the hoofs. It looks like you would naturally see the animal in this way. When we come to human figures, if this is indeed a human figure, they tend to be stick figures, very schematic. This figure is odd because the head of the figure is not human. It seems to be a sort of animal head, and there seems to be some sort of a bird on a pole, possibly a cane or a stick or a wand of some sort. But humans, when they did appear in these paintings, were always stick figures, and the animals were always naturalistic. Again, why that was the case, nobody seems to know. One of the more recent theories as to what this art was about was that it was shamanistic, created by shamanistic painters who went into trances deep and deep inside the cave, and they painted their visions and their dreams. For what reason, we're not sure, but a lot of the other things that occur in the caves, for example, the little dots, which also appear, and this doesn't just happen in France, this happens in Spain, and this happens in Africa, and this happens in Eastern Europe, where you get realistic animals, stick people, and then all of these patterns of dots, whether they're in circles or straight lines or squares. Why they're there, we don't know. The video that I have for this week talks a little bit about that as the dot pattern relating somewhat to trance. So again, we have this ancient art deep, deep inside the caves. Its meaning, again, is enigmatic. But what's extraordinary is the high skill of development. We don't tend to see a lot of, and I go back, I called this practice earlier, but I don't know that, I'm just saying it. But we don't see a lot of really, really bad, clumsy drawings of animals getting better and better through time. We tend to get a very, very good, this is moderately good to a very excellent sort of drawing range. We don't have a lot of practice works. That might simply just be because we haven't discovered them yet. They might still be out there. But what we do have from the evidence currently in existence is a very high quality of observation and draftsmanship, and a very enigmatic use of stick figures, dots, next to naturalistic animals. The Mesolithic period, the period that came after this, was a transitional period. I talked earlier about the the Paleolithic as being nomadic. Here we're beginning to get the beginnings of settlements by rivers and streams. We're beginning to get fishing. People were still largely nomadic, but we're getting evidence of settlements. And so I call this a transition period because it's moving into the Neolithic, which is where people began to settle. But in the Mesolithic period, we begin to get similar cave art, but here it tends to be more in the outsides of the caves. And again, we can see those very strange kind of stick figure people, beings, creatures. Here you can see an animal and a horn and a schematic of a head. Very similar to the Hawaiian petroglyphs. We would call these petroglyphs. Again, what they mean, what they signify is beyond us, but they seem to be very, very strange, unnaturalistic kinds of creatures. Here we see in Azerbaijan outside of a cave. Could represent families or dynasties or beings. One theory is that they're creatures from outer space. Who knows? We're in no position to really dismiss anybody's theory because we don't have a lot of evidence as to who's right and who's wrong. The Neolithic period, however, marks a decisive break. Here we have the beginning of agriculture, farming, livestock, the division of labor, and eventually the creation of cities. Now this is crucial. When people stopped chasing animals, stopped moving around and stayed still, they began to bring the animals to themselves. So by raising livestock, they began to bring the plants to themselves, agriculture. And so when they settled down, there was this enormous change in the structure of the society, in the art, in religious beliefs. So, for example, the minute you had agriculture and livestock, you began to get what we would call surplus, things left over, more than you needed. So not everybody had to be doing the same kinds of roles. Plus, you would get maybe one settlement which was more successful than another, so you might have raids and people trying to take your food. So we begin to get divisions of labor where you might get people who become more like the soldiers or the watchers or the protectors versus the hunters. We might then have the shamans, the priestly class, and so we begin to get a society that becomes more divided in terms of its labor, its workforce, its structure, its organization. And as time went on, these began to grow bigger and bigger, to come into contact with each other, to come into conflict with each other. And so here we have conquests and battles and priests and accountants and all sorts of things which eventually led to urbanization, which was the creation of the first cities. Now, in terms of the art, the big change that we notice is that the Paleolithic art was primarily naturalistic, as we've seen in the animals, not the humans, but the animals. In the Neolithic, we get what's called geometric abstraction. We've talked about abstraction as being a sort of simplification of the forms, which is what it is. So we'll take the animals, the naturalism of the animals, and we'll simplify it. But we'll also make it very geometric, bringing in triangles and circles and squares and cubes. And we can see that very clearly on this beaker from Susa in Iran. And we see right here an animal. There's his body, there's the head, be some sort of goat. Here's the horns going up and around the circle and the tail. Now obviously a goat doesn't look like this. This is what's meant by abstraction, and the way that it is working geometrically with the circles and the symmetries of the shapes would give it that geometric quality. And we see the same thing happening here. We see a running animal going around the vase, and we also see these long-necked kind of birds at the top. So the imagery becomes part of a design, part of a pattern. So you're not drawing the animal really as it looks. You're drawing the animal as a shape, as a visual element that you organize into a form, in this case, a beaker. Around 3000 BC, we begin to get the beginnings of civilization, those things I just talked about, but also the development of written language, sciences, astronomies, larger political structures, larger priestly classes. And this happened primarily in two areas, Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, and also the Indus Valley in modern-day India and Pakistan. The Indus Valley we know very little about. Those civilizations are only recently being discovered. Some of the language has not yet been deciphered. If you went back 20 years and took this class or a history class, they would have told you it was just Mesopotamia, which means between the rivers. So this is the area that most of the study and the scholarship in the history has so far developed in terms of where modern humans developed from. Here's Saudi Arabia and Africa and modern-day Turkey. And what happened was between these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, as they come down into the Persian Gulf, we begin to get very fertile and lush lands, and the creation of civilizations along those rivers, the Sumerian culture, the Akkadian culture, the Babylonian culture. And these cultures grew up, built pyramids, great fortresses, had armies. And so this was a dramatic outgrowth of that settling down, that change from the nomadic to the agricultural way of life. And so in Ur, we have ziggurats, these giant stone temples, and obviously they still exist today. We see the steps going up here. And so the level of development, the architectural, the engineering, and the artistic level of development was vast, was stunning. It's even led some people to believe that, well, this is when UFOs must have landed and taught everybody everything, because in a very short period of time, all of a sudden we went to painting animals on cave walls to building things like this, having writing, and sciences dealing with the stars. So here's another view of the ziggurat. A ziggurat is what they were called rather than pyramids. pyramid structures, but not quite pyramids as we understand them in the Egyptian sense. Here is the head of one of the rulers, and we can see it's made out of metal. What's interesting about this is, from an artistic point of view, is we can see that that same geometric abstraction exists, that the noses don't really look like this, beards don't really look like this, everything is what we call stylized, eyebrows don't look like this. So they're representative of a face, but it's not a real face, and so we call this kind of effect also stylization, where these kind of rows and this kind of perfect curling, and look at the hair under the lower lip down here. It's kind of stylized, it's abstracted, and it's geometric in that sense. We also notice from a political or religious point of view that the eyes were gouged out. This was a very common practice. When one culture conquered another culture, they would destroy the art and loot the art, and the eyes apparently probably contained precious stones, and so they would have been gouged out and taken, maybe the head left or the head taken also. And so we have this sort of political defacement of art, destruction of art, and we saw that most recently with the Taliban and years ago in Afghanistan, destroying all the religious structures. And so this goes back to our discussion on culture and the meaning of art, and any ruler or dictator knows that the best way to control the people is to destroy their culture, not just their economic livelihoods, but take away their soul, in a sense. Another view of the same piece. This would have been a winged bull guarding the gates. Again, we get that stylization. If anybody's ever seen a feather or a wing, you know it doesn't quite look this neat and this perfect. We also get this strange mix, this hybrid of a human head on a bull's body with wings. These would have been sentinels or guardians outside the gates of the temples. Here we have writing, text, referring to various passages in the literature of the times, or recording conquests and battles. All these things also would have been painted. This is an interesting aspect we'll come to in a little while when we look at Egypt. But what we see in many museums is often just stone, but what the people of the time saw was something very, very different. So here's an example. This is a Babylonian gate called the Ishtar Gate with glazed bricks. And so this is, blue glazed bricks with animals and this sort of decoration, these orange and blue and green colors. We go back to a model of how it would have looked. This is the piece that I showed you, but in this replica we can see how it functioned as part of a bigger structure. And this is, as we can see, miles away from the sort of hunting and gathering and Venus figurines that we saw previously. This is the beginnings of cities, civilizations that have come to shape and dominate the world ever since. Egypt was also an area where this happened. Mesopotamia had a slight head start, but primarily Egypt developed in tandem with Mesopotamian culture and with Indus Valley cultures, and Egypt is something many of us are much more familiar with through movies and art. This is one of the earliest Egyptian works of art, the Palette of Narmer, which is Narmer here, right here, conquering and uniting lower and southern and northern Egypt. And we see here the sort of people that he's captured. Here he is with the people, slaves, and the slaves are all listed here. And so this tells the story of the unification of Egypt. One thing we want to notice here, we're going to find in a lot of art, is not just the stylization, not just the abstraction. People don't look exactly like this, but also the size. Notice how small these people are. They're not Menehune. They're not his children. They're less important people. So in Egypt, as in Babylon and Mesopotamia, the more important you are, the bigger you are as a figure in that society, the more power you have, the larger you're depicted. And so here is the important person, and here are the lesser important people and the lesser important people. So size became an indicator of your status, and we call this hierarchic scaling. Hierarchic coming from the word hierarchy, And so hierarchic scaling is something we're going to talk about and see a lot in art, and it's something you want to certainly remember. Typical example of Egyptian sculpture. By typical, I mean the figures look very, very stiff, very, very rigid. There is a sense of three-dimensionality and realism in the sort of the pectoral muscles or the muscles around the knee and the shin bones. But by and large, they're very sort of unrealistic and unnaturalistic. They have a lot of common features, so you'll often find the hands at the side, clenched in fists, with one foot forward, and the head looking straight ahead. And so these become patterns of sculpture that are repeated all throughout the Mesopotamian world, the Egyptian world, and we'll even see next week in the Greek world. You'll also notice that the stone is filling in between the legs, and that the figure is leaning against stone. So these are not freestanding figures. They're very solid, they're very compact, and often meant to be seen from one side, obviously in this case the front. Here we have the most famous Egyptian artifact, the Pyramids of Giza. Nearly 3,000 years old, and they're still standing, but not in their original state. Originally they were faced in limestone, so they would have appeared completely white to anybody walking through the desert, and the tips of the pyramids were capped with golden tips. And so you can imagine the effect on the people living at the time, walking through the desert, seeing these giant white structures with these gold tops, and this is an artist rendition of what it might have looked like. And so we're beginning to get something very interesting happening in art, and that is this whole idea of scale. We talked about hierarchic scaling as being important. Well, bigger was better. That was the whole concept. And so the pyramids came out of that philosophy. And so cultures were designing buildings and sculptures and structures to be big and massive and intimidating and powerful. And this goes hand in hand with a type of art, an approach to art. And here's Giza today, full of pollution. Goes hand in hand with a type of art that we have labeled Machtkunst. It's a German word. It means power, Macht, art, Kunst, power art. And so when you are a peasant walking around the deserts of Egypt, here you are, you're this small, and you see something this big, this solid, this powerful, it blows you away. You're impressed that you could not possibly question the authority or the rightness of this culture. And so pharaohs and priests and dynasties built massive structures that were emblems to their power and their domination. And so the small person, the regular person in the street, was completely blown away and captivated by this. And so we have a society where you don't really question those in power, because this is what they represent and this is what you represent. And Egyptian culture stayed pretty much the same, minor variations for nearly 2,500 years. So not a lot of people plotting revolutions and change. The size and the power of the art and the structure of the society and the way it was organized was pretty rigid, pretty powerful, and pretty immovable, timeless, we might say. And so we look at this art, we notice again characteristic features of Egyptian art: facing forward, very stiff, very rigid. I notice that the faces look kind of the same with these two, slightly different here. It's not that they looked the same, it's just how you would portray. So what we have here is Ramses and his queen. And so Ramses, for example, any pharaoh would always have a beard, and Pharaoh's eyes were always made the same way, and Pharaoh's lips were made the same way, and that was part of the consistency of the art. Which is why King Tut, who died when he was still a teenager, always has that kind of braided beard coming out of his chin. That just means he's a pharaoh. That he was able to grow a beard that long is probably highly improbable. The other thing about Egyptian art, which I talked about earlier in relation to the Babylonian art, was that it was painted. And here's a good example. Primarily, most of the paint has fallen off the works, washed off, weathered off over time, but certain works that were buried in tombs, as this was, preserved their color. So this is Queen Nefertiti, and you can see the degree of painting and detail on the skin and the eyes and the ornaments of the headdress and the necklace was very highly developed. And so this gives us a very different picture of these brown sandstone buildings that we see in Egypt. And many artists have attempted representations of what Egypt probably was like. This would have been the same with Babylon and Sumeria, and as we'll see next week, also with Greece and Rome. These were cultures that were very colorful. But our image today, when we go to museums, is stark contrast to that. And so another artist's rendition. So everything we see, going back, when we say to these pharaohs, all of this would have been paint. All of it would have been color, not the sort of beige brown sandstone that we see today. When we come to Egyptian painting, it's very clear to identify it. It has very specific features, and this is a good example. You'll notice that the head is always in profile. The torso is always frontal, in other words, the shoulders are facing us, and that the feet are always in profile. And this style, this way of making art, like I said earlier, stayed consistent for nearly 2,500 years. It didn't change. There were rules of depiction, and these would have been called canons of proportion. I'll just skip ahead here. These are an example of the canons of proportion. So when you were an artist, you learned that a head was so many squares high, a foot was so many squares long, and this is a good example to talk about, where we've got the feet in profile, the torso frontal, the head in profile, and you can't see very well, but the eye is also frontal. Now the question is, why did the Egyptians do this? Why did they not have people in all different positions and poses? It's because the art of the Egyptians is not based on the eye. It's not based on how things looked. It's based on the mind. It's based on how you understand things. So a foot, for example, feet protrude. They stick out. So when you portray a foot, you portray it from its most characteristic angle. In other words, you make it stick out. You see its length. You go from the heel out. You don't have the foot coming towards you, because then it would just be like a little stub with 5 little circles. Similarly with the torso, you don't have the shoulders, one shoulder facing you and one shoulder behind, because then it would just look like a little bump right here. It really wouldn't show the shoulders. And the same applies to the face. So we look at the face. We understand noses as protruding, so we don't show the nose from the front, we show it from the side. But we understand eyes from the front, which is why many of the Egyptians painted the eye from a frontal position. And so we go back, we can see those characteristics throughout all of the art. Here we have the hierarchic scaling, the large figure, the most important person, probably his wife, and then maybe his daughter. Okay. Now these rules of how to make art applied mostly to the important people, less so to the less important people. And as we go down the social ladder, these rules begin to break down. So we do begin to get pictures of slaves, of captives, that are portrayed much more freely, much more naturalistically. When we come to animals, we get this incredibly high degree of observation and realism. And so these strict laws of how to portray things don't apply when we come to animals. And when we zoom in here, here he is hunting. We zoom in here to the cat in this picture, is another close-up. We see the markings of the cat, the details of the claws. We see the butterflies with the markings, all the birds, they're overlapping each other, they're touching each other, the cat's hunting. And so we get this incredible degree of realism that we don't find in the figures, which are just heavily outlined and stiff. And so it's an interesting fact of how these artworks were portrayed. These rules, these canons of proportion, applied to what was important. They applied less to what was not so important. And then we also have this another example, has everything we talked about. Here we have the defaced faces. So incoming dynasty or invading army would have removed the individual faces. Here are the important people. Here are their wives. Here are their children. And these guys here would be the slaves. And they're working away. These people are hunting and fishing. And notice that the water is depicted below the boats, just like a child would have depicted it. We're looking down on the water because this is kind of an inlet. It's not a sort of bulge in the water with a fountain. It's an inlet with some reeds in the back. But notice that the fish, we're seeing the fish from the side. These are not fish that are dead lying on the surface. The same rule applies. If you want to paint something, you want to see it so you can identify it. So you paint it from the side, even though technically we're looking down on it in this painting. So this was a way of making art that came to dominate world art all the way through. The Greeks became the only change, the only exception to that, but after the Greeks it went right back to this. This is where you're making art based on how you understand and believe things to be, not how you see them. So an optical based art, an art based on your eye, was not a concern for the vast majority of cultures on this planet. Making art that tells a story, that communicates information, and that is very clear to see and clear to understand was the primary priority of art making for cultures all over the planet. When we come to about 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquers Egypt, and we leave Egypt and we leave the ancient world. We move into the beginnings of the modern world, which is often associated with Greece, and that will be next week's lecture.